looking good.
The night was quiet in Los Angeles. No crowds. No flashing cameras. No screaming fans calling her name. Just a dimly lit hotel corridor, the soft hum of air conditioning, and a door that would soon become one of the most haunting symbols in rock history. Janis Joplin was supposed to be unstoppable. To the world, she was the raw voice of a generation, a woman who could tear through silence with a scream that felt like freedom itself. She had just finished recording what many believed would be her greatest album. Her future, at least on paper, had never looked brighter. And yet, in those final hours, Janis was alone. No stage lights. No band. No audience to absorb the pain she had spent her entire life turning into music. Only a room, a night that stretched on without witnesses, and a silence that felt heavier than any applause she had ever received. What really happened in those final hours? How did a woman who seemed to live so loudly disappear so quietly? Were there signs, warnings, moments when someone could have stepped in but didn't? And was her death simply an accident, or the inevitable end of a life burning too fast, too intensely, for too long? To understand how Janis Joplin died, we have to do more than read a headline. We have to slow time down. We have to walk back through her last day, then her last weeks, and finally through the life that led her there, to a room where the world's most explosive voice was reduced to silence. This is not just the story of how Janis Joplin died. This is the story of how a legend was born in the very moment her life ended. The news broke quietly at first, then all at once. On the morning of October 4, 1970, word began to spread through radio stations, newsrooms, and record labels. Janis Joplin was dead. 27 years old. Found in her hotel room in Los Angeles. The details were scarce. The shock was immediate. For fans, it felt unreal. Janis was everywhere, her voice still pouring out of car radios, dorm rooms, smoky bars. Pearl, the album she had been recording, wasn't even finished yet. To many, she wasn't a memory. She was still present tense. Within hours, the headlines hardened. Rock star found dead. Another talent lost at 27. The comparisons came fast, almost too fast. Brian Jones, Jimi Hendrix, now Janis. 3 voices, 3 symbols of a generation, gone within 2 years. It felt less like coincidence and more like a pattern people were afraid to name. Outside the music world, the story quickly became something darker. Commentators debated whether this was the cost of fame, the price of excess, or a warning sign of a culture spiraling out of control. Janis Joplin was no longer just a singer. Her death was being framed as evidence. Inside the industry, the reaction was different, quieter, heavier. Musicians who had shared stages with her struggled to put words together. Producers and engineers replayed recent sessions in their minds, wondering if they had missed something. Friends spoke of her optimism in the studio, her laughter between takes, her excitement about the album she believed would finally show who she really was. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. A woman described as hopeful, focused, and creatively alive had died alone just days later. The gap between those two images, Janis the artist reborn, and Janis the woman found lifeless in a room, demanded answers. Almost immediately, questions followed the shock. Who had seen her last? What had she been doing the night before? Why was she alone? And how could someone so visible, so loud, vanish without anyone noticing until it was too late? As reporters began tracing her final movements, the story shifted from tragedy to investigation. Because this wasn't just about loss. It was about timing. About warnings. About whether the signs were always there, hidden beneath applause and myth. And as the world mourned Janis Joplin, one uncomfortable truth began to surface: her death did not come out of nowhere. It came at the end of a long, uneven road, one paved with brilliance, loneliness, and a hunger for connection that fame could never satisfy. To understand that road, we have to go back. Not to the hotel room, but to the life that made that final silence possible. Long before the headlines, before the stages and the screaming crowds, Janis Joplin was a girl who never quite fit the world she was born into. She grew up in Port Arthur, Texas, a conservative, oil refinery town where difference was not celebrated, but punished. From an early age, Janis stood out. She was outspoken, intellectually curious, uninterested in the rigid expectations placed on young women. And for that, she paid a price. Classmates mocked her appearance, her voice, her refusal to conform. The loneliness she felt there would follow her for the rest of her life. Music became her refuge. Blues records, raw and aching, spoke a language she understood instinctively. These were voices that carried pain without apology, voices that didn't ask permission to exist. Janis didn't just listen to them, she absorbed them. They taught her that suffering could be transformed into sound. When she left Texas for college, and later for the countercultural enclaves of California, it felt like escape. San Francisco in the mid-1960s was chaotic, idealistic, and hungry for new voices. Janis found a place where being strange wasn't a liability, it was currency. Her voice, once ridiculed, now stopped people in their tracks. But even as her career accelerated, something remained unresolved. On stage, Janis was fearless. She screamed, laughed, wept into the microphone. Offstage, she struggled with insecurity, rejection, and an overwhelming need to be loved. Fame amplified everything, including the emptiness. The rise was meteoric. With Big Brother and the holding company, Janis became the embodiment of the era's emotional excess. Her performance at Monterey Pop in 1967 wasn't just a breakthrough, it was a cultural detonation. Overnight, she was no longer an outsider. She was a symbol. Yet symbols are dangerous things to become. The public image hardened quickly: Janis the wild one, Janis the drunk, Janis the voice that came from pain and lived in chaos. That myth followed her everywhere, even when she tried to move beyond it. As success grew, so did the pressure. Relationships fractured under the weight of touring and expectation. Substance use, initially a social escape, began to take on a darker role, a way to quiet the self-doubt that applause couldn't touch. The line between coping and dependence blurred. By the time she embarked on a solo career, Janis was chasing something more than success. She wanted validation without performance. Love without an audience. A sense of home that had eluded her since childhood. Those desires shaped her choices, personal, creative, and destructive. They also set the stage for the contradictions that defined her final chapter: a woman celebrated for her freedom, privately desperate for stability, a star at the height of her powers, quietly losing control. The road to the hotel room didn't begin in Los Angeles. It began years earlier, in a small Texas town, in moments of rejection that never truly healed, only found a voice loud enough to drown them out. As Janis Joplin's fame expanded, so did the distance between who she was on stage and who she became when the lights went out. Publicly, she was unstoppable. Every performance felt like an emotional detonation. Critics praised her authenticity. Fans saw her as fearless, liberated, untouchable. But behind that image was a woman constantly negotiating with her own doubt. The louder the applause grew, the more she feared what would happen when it stopped. Substances crept in not as a rebellion, but as relief. At first, they softened the edges: the anxiety before shows, the loneliness of hotel rooms, the constant movement from city to city. Over time, that relief became a necessity. The boundary between choice and compulsion eroded quietly, almost invisibly. There were attempts to regain control. Periods of sobriety. New bands. New sounds. Janis wanted to prove she was more than the myth attached to her name. She left Big Brother and the holding company, searching for musicians who could follow her evolution rather than trap her in a moment frozen by fame. Yet reinvention carried its own pressure. Each new project felt like a referendum on her worth. If the music failed, what would remain? The industry watched closely. So did the press. Every stumble became a headline. Every relapse was treated as confirmation of a narrative she couldn't escape. Romantic relationships offered brief hope, then disappointment. Janis fell hard and often, craving intimacy that fame complicated and distorted. Rejection hit her deeply, reinforcing the fear that she was admired for her voice but not loved for herself. That fear echoed the isolation she had known long before fame arrived. Physically, the toll became harder to ignore. Exhaustion set in. Mood swings grew sharper. Friends noticed changes, moments of optimism followed by stretches of withdrawal. But in an era where excess was normalized, warning signs were easy to dismiss. What made this period especially dangerous was the illusion of progress. Janis was working again. Creating again. She sounded focused in the studio. To the outside world, she seemed to be climbing out of the darkness. In reality, she was walking a narrow line, balancing recovery and relapse without a safety net. The darker truth is that collapse rarely announces itself. It unfolds while life appears to be moving forward. And in Janis Joplin's case, the very momentum of her career, the sessions, the plans, the promise, masked how fragile her foundation had become. By the time she entered the final weeks of her life, the contradictions were fully formed. She was creatively alive but emotionally depleted. Surrounded by people yet profoundly alone. Celebrated as a symbol of freedom while quietly losing control of the one thing she needed most, herself. The descent didn't look like a fall. It looked like motion. And that made it all the more dangerous. In the weeks leading up to her death, Janis Joplin appeared to be standing at a crossroads. Professionally, she was more focused than she had been in years. Studio sessions for Pearl were intense but productive. Engineers and musicians later recalled a singer who knew exactly what she wanted, who pushed for take after take, who sounded sharper, more controlled, more present. There was talk of touring. Talk of the future. For the first time in a long while, Janis seemed to believe in what was coming next. Privately, the picture was more fragile. She was living out of hotels again, drifting between nights in the studio and long stretches of isolation. Friends noticed that her mood swung between confidence and quiet withdrawal. She spoke about wanting stability, a home, a partner, a life that didn't vanish when the show ended. But those desires clashed with the reality she was still living in. There were signs of strain. Missed connections. Moments where she pulled away from people who tried to get close. In interviews, her humor carried an edge, self-aware, but tinged with exhaustion. The laughter didn't always reach her eyes. Reports from that period described Janis trying, and sometimes failing, to stay clean. The effort itself mattered. It meant she was aware of the danger. But awareness doesn't guarantee safety, especially when old habits remain within reach and the pressure never truly lifts. In late September, the studio became her anchor. She showed up day after day, recording vocals that would later be described as some of the most vulnerable of her career. Songs about longing. About disappointment. About love that never quite arrives. Listening now, it's hard not to hear them as foreshadowing. Then there were the small moments, the ones that only seem important in hindsight. The canceled plans. The unanswered calls. The nights when she chose to be alone instead of reaching out. None of these signaled an ending on their own. Together, they formed a pattern of quiet retreat. On October 3, 1970, Janis was expected at the studio. It wasn't unusual for her to be late. She had always moved on her own schedule. But as the hours passed, concern began to replace patience. What no one knew then was that Janis was already inside her final day. A day without performances. Without witnesses. Without intervention. The momentum that had carried her forward, the music, the plans, the belief that tomorrow would come, was about to collide with a reality she could no longer outrun. And as the night fell over Los Angeles, Janis Joplin entered the last stretch of time she would ever experience. Quietly. Unseen. With the world still expecting her to show up the next morning. The final day of Janis Joplin's life did not begin with drama. It began with expectation. On October 3, 1970, Janis was staying at the Landmark Motor Hotel in Hollywood. It was a place she had used before, anonymous, unremarkable, designed for people passing through rather than settling down. She had been there while recording Pearl, using the room as a temporary refuge between long studio sessions. That afternoon, she left the hotel. According to reports, she walked to a nearby liquor store. It was a short trip, the kind no one would remember if the ending had been different. She returned with alcohol, went back to her room, and closed the door behind her. That is one of the last confirmed movements of Janis Joplin while she was alive. The rest of the day unfolded without witnesses. She did not show up at the studio that evening. At first, no one panicked. Janis had missed sessions before. She was known for keeping her own hours, for disappearing and reappearing without explanation. Absence, in her world, was not immediately alarming. Night fell in Los Angeles. Cars passed outside the hotel. Lights flickered on and off in nearby rooms. Inside Janis's room, there was no sound loud enough to draw attention. No call for help. No interruption. Sometime during the night, Janis Joplin died. The official conclusion would later describe the cause as an accidental heroin overdose, compounded by alcohol. But what matters most in those final hours is not the medical language, it is the context. Janis was alone. There was no one to notice a change in her breathing, no one to call for help, no one to slow the moment when recovery was still possible. On the morning of October 4th, concern finally turned into action. When Janis failed to appear again at the studio, members of her team went looking for her. They went to the hotel. They knocked on the door. There was no answer. Inside the room, she was found on the floor. The scene was quiet. There were no signs of struggle. No dramatic tableau. Just the stillness of a life that had ended hours earlier. She was 27 years old. The woman who had filled concert fields with sound, who had pushed her voice until it broke open, had died without an audience. Without applause. Without anyone there to hear her last breath. Time did not stop when Janis died. It kept moving, cruelly, indifferently. Outside that room, the city woke up. Inside, everything that had driven her life, the hunger for love, the fear of rejection, the need to feel something real, came to rest. What followed would stretch far beyond that hotel room. Because Janis Joplin's death was not just an ending. It was the beginning of a debate that would last decades. The investigation that followed Janis Joplin's death moved quickly, but certainty came slowly. Authorities ruled her death an accidental overdose. The conclusion was brief, clinical, and final on paper. Yet for many, it felt incomplete. Not because the facts were extraordinary, but because the circumstances raised uncomfortable questions about how someone so visible could vanish so completely in plain sight. Those closest to Janis replayed the final days in fragments. Who had seen her last? Who had spoken to her? Whether she had seemed hopeful or distant. Accounts varied, not dramatically, but just enough to leave gaps. And in those gaps, speculation took root. Some questioned the purity of the substances involved, noting that unusually strong heroin had been circulating in Los Angeles at the time. Others focused on the environment around her, the transient hotel, the lack of supervision, the ease with which isolation had become routine. Was this a freak accident, or the predictable result of a system that offered access without protection? The media, meanwhile, struggled to balance reverence and sensationalism. Headlines invoked the growing list of artists lost young, framing Janis as another chapter in a narrative of excess. The phrase, 27 Club, began to crystallize, turning personal tragedy into cultural shorthand. It was a way to make sense of loss by categorizing it, and in doing so, it risked flattening the human story beneath. Friends and collaborators pushed back against the mythologizing. They spoke of Janis's discipline in the studio, her plans for the future, her belief that Pearl represented a turning point. To them, the idea that she was simply spiraling felt wrong. She was trying. She was working. She was imagining a life beyond survival. That contradiction fueled debate. How could someone building toward something new also be so vulnerable? The answer, uncomfortable as it was, lay in the reality that recovery is not a straight line. Progress can coexist with danger. Hope does not cancel risk. No evidence ever emerged to suggest foul play. No hidden conspiracy was uncovered. And yet, the questions persisted, not because the case was unsolved, but because it reflected something larger. Janis Joplin's death exposed the fragility of artists navigating fame without safeguards, in an era that celebrated freedom but rarely addressed its cost. As years passed, the focus shifted from blame to meaning. Her death became a reference point in conversations about addiction, mental health, and the responsibilities of the industry. It forced an acknowledgement that talent alone does not protect against isolation, and that visibility is not the same as being seen. The investigation closed. The arguments quieted. But the unease never fully disappeared. Because what lingered wasn't suspicion. It was recognition. Recognition that Janis Joplin's final hours were not an anomaly, they were a warning. In the years after her death, Janis Joplin stopped aging. There would be no decline, no comeback tour, no slow fading from relevance. She was preserved in a moment, forever young, forever burning, forever unfinished. The album she left behind, Pearl, became both a farewell and a promise, its songs carrying a clarity and vulnerability that suggested she was just beginning to understand herself. To the world, Janis became a legend. Her voice remained unmatched, her image iconic, her place in music history unquestioned. She stood as proof that emotion could be louder than technique, that honesty could outweigh polish. For countless artists who followed, she became a reference point, not just for how to sing, but for how deeply one could feel. But legends often come at a cost. When we strip away the mythology, what remains is a woman who wanted connection more than applause. Someone who spent her life turning pain into sound because silence felt unbearable. In her final hours, there was no stage left to stand on, only the quiet she had always feared. Looking back now, it's tempting to romanticize that ending. To fold it neatly into a narrative of brilliance and excess. But doing so risks missing the lesson embedded in those last moments. Janis Joplin did not die because she lacked talent, success, or recognition. She died because none of those things could replace care, stability, or human closeness. Her final hours ask us difficult questions. About how we treat the people we celebrate. About the systems that profit from intensity but rarely protect those who burn brightest. About the difference between being seen and being understood. In the end, Janis Joplin gave the world everything she had, her voice, her pain, her truth. What she did not receive in return was the one thing she searched for all along, a place where she could finally rest. And perhaps that is why her story still resonates. Not because of how she died, but because in those final, silent hours, she revealed something timeless, that even legends are human, and that the loudest voices often hide the deepest loneliness.